Hi everyone, welcome to another recording for Essex Political Science. Our main topic for today is the European Union. Before we get into this, um, perhaps it would be best, to give a quick recap of the steps we've taken in order to get to this point. Remember that first of all, we talked about two different systems of government, the unitary and the federal systems. Okay. Um, and within the context of our consideration of these, we discussed local government, the distinction between central authorities and peripheral political bodies. So these things, as you can see, they refer to multi-level governance, meaning the exercise of power at different levels and in certain instances, in different geographical areas. Multi-level governance also uh, is also relevant in the discussion of regionalism. Okay, regionalism is a phenomenon, another phenomenon of multi-level governance, but it is uh, regionalism can go beyond the level of the nation state, meaning that um, this phenomenon refers to the formation of organizations uh, that consist of members that belong to either a geographical area, a distinct geographical area, or members that share certain things in common. For instance, political ideals and values, common goals. And within the context of our consideration of regionalism, we introduce the European Union as probably the prime example of economic regionalism. Okay, it has emerged as a kind of model for this type of organization consisting of different member states that that have decided to come together in order to achieve certain goals that they take to be communal. Okay, now my main intention in this recording is to give you an overview of the European Union, much like this map here, which gives us a broad view of the EU as an organization, as a political entity. I want to do this before we get into more detail about the different bodies and institutions within the EU. As you can see from this map, there's a list of the current members. Of course, this list has to be updated given recent events. Also, the map itself gives you a good idea of the scope, you know, the scope of the EU as a regional organization. In particular, it gives us a bit of information about, the politically important cities in which the different institutions are located. So you have Brussels, Luxembourg, Frankfurt, and Strasbourg. Um, Also gives you a glimpse of the various institutions and bodies here. Okay. Now, like I said, my goal here is to give you an overview. One way to do this is to talk about the main values and ideals of the EU, some of its to talk about some of its political features and also some of the major concerns that occupy the EU's leaders these days, or certain concerns that have been long standing, you know, have been there since the creation of this community and which has remained, uh, certain concerns which have remained throughout the various incarnations and transformations of this regional organization. So, what are the main values and ideals? You could say that the EU is founded upon the idea of multilateralism. This is the idea that a nation state doesn't have to do everything alone. And in cases of conflict, the primary option isn't necessarily war with its neighbor or neighbors. Okay. The idea of multilateralism also makes it possible to achieve and maintain peace on the continent after centuries of warfare, conflict, instability, and of course, suffering for ordinary people. It makes progress more likely, more achievable progress in terms of ensuring that citizens enjoy certain liberties and progress in terms of um, raising the quality of life of the different peoples who inhabit the continent. Multilateralism obviously, contains the idea of cooperation, and the EU as an economic regional entity, promotes economic cooperation through the creation of the single market, um, the adoption of the currency, the euro, and at the same time you know the the promotion or the use of open borders, meaning at the same time that you know open borders refer not only to the idea that industries can uh, establish links and interact with uh, one another. Industries and government can interact across borders, but also that people can move about, can decide where they want to live and work. With fewer restrictions, there's more freedom of movement, um, greater exchange, and all of this, of course, all of this has been happening in the course of several decades with an explicit commitment to the values of liberal democracy, meaning that, the idea that people actually have political power. Each citizen has political power, best expressed through the vote, one person, one vote, and could always, in principle, participate in the political life of the EU through the different institutions. And at the same time, liberal, that adjective signals, um, a basic, fundamental belief in the value of freedom, of civil liberties, that these things are protected, that our ability to move about, our ability to freedom to express ourselves, to participate in politics, express dissent, uh, form organizations, assemble, um, you know, have a certain lifestyle. All of these are guaranteed. Okay, now let me turn to a couple of political features of the EU that I want to emphasize. So there are two. Um, the EU it requires and promotes intergovernmentalism. What does that mean? It means that you know the way the EU works requires the cooperation between the governments of the different nation states and their leaders and representatives. Okay, so this intergovernmental feature is embodied by, for instance, the European Council. So this is the executive body that consists of the various heads of state and government coming from the individual um, nation state members of the EU. This body, the European Council, sets the broad policy agenda for the entire organization. Also, you have the Council of Ministers, another another institution, another body that's technically under the jurisdiction of the European Council, but and as such is also a body that consists of the national ministers coming from the different member states. And, you know, as ministers, they represent the interests of the member states, but they still have to work together with the other representatives coming from the other nations. So the idea here is cooperation. The idea here is working together on common goals. On the other hand, you have the more supranatural natural features of the European Union. Supranational national meaning that there are certain authorities and powers that go beyond the nation state. These features are embodied by the European Commission, for instance. So the European Commission consists of commissioners coming from the different member states, but these commissioners, as well as the president, they are supposed to ensure and work towards the interests of the EU as an organization more than look out for the particular interests of the countries from which they come. Okay, and the European Commission makes decisions that that are that go beyond the powers of the nation state. The same or a similar case, a similar thing can be said of the Court of Justice of the EU as the interpreter of EU law and as the settler of disputes. It can make decisions that go well beyond the powers of nation states, the different EU institutions, industries, companies, and citizens. Now, lastly, very briefly, I would like to turn to some of the concerns faced by the European Union. So you have the rise of populist nationalism. So how do you deal with populist nationalism, bordering on violations of um, let's say certain EU values and also the rights of sections of the population? How do you deal with that and balance that with the express commitment to liberal democracy? Secondly, you have the tension between federalist aspirations, meaning a desire for a greater union, for a greater union within the EU, and the emergence of a really a more federal kind of body or government versus the problems that come with expansion of dealing with so many members, cultures, beliefs, and the problem of um, making it work, bureaucratically speaking. And lastly, the concern about democratic legitimacy that the EU is so far removed from its citizens that maybe many of its institutions do not really represent, you know, the populace. Okay,